Summer 2019. More than 38,000 fires raged across the Amazon. Fires that were man-made. Over the past 50 years, almost 17% of the world's largest rainforest has been cleared. And globally, deforestation has almost doubled in just 5 years. Since the start of human civilization, it's estimated that the number of trees around the world has fallen by almost half. Clearing forests increases carbon dioxide levels, but planting them could store away some of the carbon already in the atmosphere.
Everyone is looking for a silver bullet to get our way out of this really difficult problem of climate change. Some people have latched onto tree planting as a kind of panacea. The reality is, tree planting is not always good.
This woman runs safaris in England. Guests are not only here to see wild animals, they're here to see wild trees.
If you can imagine when we were farming back in the 1980s through the 90s, this would have been a field of one particular crop as far as the eye can see.
Almost 20 years ago, Isabella Tree, yes, that is her real name, handed 1,400 hectares of Sussex farmland back to nature by doing, well, nothing. She thinks this is the best way to use the land to help tackle climate change.
Wilding is a hands-off approach. It's become a sort of environment that is a nursery for open-grown, freely regenerating trees. Within 20 years, we have doubled our carbon sequestered in the soil. We've got the scrub, we've got the grasses, we've got the trees. All that will be contributing to this carbon sink.
To stabilise the climate, global carbon emissions need to drop to net zero by 2050.
And of course, not all sectors are going to get down to zero emissions by 2050.
Simon Lewis is a professor of global change science.
We need to take some carbon out of the atmosphere, and one of the cheapest and easiest ways is to plant trees. Around half the dry weight of a tree is carbon. As trees grow, they take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in their trunks, leaves and roots, which helps slow the rate of climate change.
And there's never been more global ambition to plant trees. In 2014, 51 countries pledged to plant over 3.5 million square kilometres of forest by 2030, an area slightly larger than India.
Ethiopia has made its mark in the record books by planting over 350 million trees in a single day.
The 2030 target looks likely to be met, but there's a catch.
When you dig down into the numbers of these forests, almost half the area pledged so far by countries is actually for monoculture plantations. And that means a single species planted over thousands and thousands of hectares.
Monoculture tree plantations, like eucalyptus, grow quickly, but the trees are harvested every 10 or so years, releasing much of the carbon stored in the tree back into the atmosphere, which means that, according to some studies, they'll store only around 1/40th of the carbon natural forests do over the long term.
So it's made into short-term products like paper, and then when that paper is used and then discarded, it decomposes, and that carbon goes back into the atmosphere.
Simon analysed pledges from 43 countries in the tropics and subtropics.
These big announcements are not going to deliver on the carbon capture that we're expecting. If they were all natural forests, we would sequester 42 billion tonnes of carbon this century.
In fact, those pledges to plant millions of trees actually promise to store 26 billion tonnes less carbon than they could. Sometimes the motives for planting forests are less green than they might appear. By 2020, Ireland ought to have cut greenhouse gas emissions by 20% below 2005 levels. But at current rates, it will have reduced them by only 5%. Planting forests might help Ireland avoid massive penalties for missing EU targets, because the potential carbon these forests could store in the future can be counted as a carbon credit today. In the 1920s, Ireland had the lowest forest cover in Europe at around 1%. That's now risen to 11%, and the government has set a target to cover 18% of the land with forest by 2046.
In Ireland, they're rapidly increasing the amount of forest cover, but it's overwhelmingly going towards monoculture plantations of conifers.
And now local community groups are protesting against these monoculture tree plantations. They say they're doing more harm than good.
Because these monoculture plantations are about getting the maximum yield as fast as possible, they often apply fertilizers which contribute to greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. Conifer plantations are very densely stocked, so cut out almost all the light, are very poor for biodiversity and can really affect people living nearby.
Tree planting programs invariably have an impact on the people living nearby. In East Africa, one project is demonstrating what can be achieved when there's genuine buy-in from the local communities. Green Ethiopia is a mixed tree planting charity.
We plant seedlings in rural areas of Ethiopia that is heavily affected by degradation due to deforestation.
The land is communally owned, and cooperatives of local women receive benefits for planting trees, which are protected from being harvested.
Empowering the local community on tree planting contribute a lot for the sustainability of forestation activities because it creates a sense of ownership. The local communities strongly participate on planting, managing and conserving the sites.
Here, conserving is just as important as planting. Green Ethiopia assesses whether the condition of the land is good enough to regenerate by itself. When it is, on about a third of the area the charity runs, they leave it alone. Just like Isabella Tree back in England.
Perhaps the right way to think about tree planting is just leave the land and it can do it spontaneously itself. There's no need for interventions by humans in most cases.
But this approach brings its own challenges.
The problem with this kind of natural regeneration is that it's very difficult to get funding. The funding is all driven by targets, the numbers game. In a regenerated landscape like this, we can't have any idea of how many oaks there'll be or how many crab apples will come.
Monoculture plantations are often preferred because they make money. So some experts are looking to a future where carbon payments could create financial incentives for natural forests.
If carbon becomes much more important as a commodity, then perhaps these natural forests would become more profitable than plantations. There's a real opportunity here to shift the incentives towards getting benefits for the climate and benefits for local people and benefits for local wildlife.
Ultimately, though, the trouble with trees tackling climate change is space.
There's just not enough land in the world to plant enough trees to offset all the carbon emissions from fossil fuels. We could say, let's restore forest on every single piece of land that used to have forest on from before agriculture. And if we did that, it would be about 200 billion tons of carbon. Now that sounds a lot, but to put it in context, that's about 20 years worth of emissions at present rates. Tree planting might be looked at as a saviour, but it's not. It's not an excuse not to cut fossil fuel emissions.
I'm Sarah, the director of this film. If you want to learn more about this topic, you can watch the story behind trees and climate change at the link opposite. At the other link, you can find some articles we use for research and some other exclusive materials. Thanks for watching.